Hey everybody, you're listening to Busters, the podcast that deals with an entire director's oeuvre, one episode at a time. I'm George Fragopoulos. Please, as usual, rate and review and subscribe wherever possible. And also, in the spirit of this episode on John Cassavetes' Husbands, make sure to give us 5 stars, but please do write in the review comments, terrible, you're awful, where's the passion? And when you, if you've seen Husbands, that makes total and complete sense. And if you listen to this episode, that also will make total complete sense because Ben Gazzara is an absolute fucking lunatic in this episode. But we love him. We love him for it. And that's about it. So thanks for listening. And again, this goes out to all of our one fan. Thank you.
I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
And this
is Oeuvre Busters. This should be our intro music.
Why am I only hearing one? Oh, because it's mono. Yeah.
Me too.
I'm a professional media maker.
You have mono? Stay away.
I got it from... I don't fucking know. Welcome to Oeuvre Busters, the show where we talk good movies like they're bad movies.
At least that's the idea.
George, how you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. I've been
a tough couple days.
Method podcasting. So yeah. I've been just drinking and raging for the last 72 hours to prepare for this.
For 4 days, and actually, George, I wanted to keep the buzz going.
Oh boy, here we go.
So
this is a surprise, folks. I don't know what's happening.
I got us some hard beverages.
Oh, well, I could have also done this.
Wait, one of these fell on the floor. So
should we?
Let's open.
We should do it carefully.
Yeah, hang on. Yeah, let's just.
All right, so mine's good.
Okay, so these are beers.
Let's do it.
These are beers. Cheers to this Budweiser can.
To the ghosts of all of these guys. They're all dead, right?
I realized that watching the movie.
Oh, that's depressing.
We should probably talk about why we've been. Oh, that's good. That's good.
Oh, that's good Canada. I mean, that's
seltzer.
Yeah.
Terrible. You're terrible. No passion.
We'll get to that line later in the movie. So Husbands, 1970.
We're talking about the film Husbands, directed by John Cassavetes, the Golden Greek.
Which you should know if you've listened to
it's your Golden Greek.
Any of the previous episodes.
Yeah, we're on a Cassavetes kick. This is how this whole thing got started. This terrible idea is because we talked about this movie.
You should briefly maybe talk about your man crush. When it comes to this film.
So, yeah, I did not see this movie before seeing the infamous Dick Cavett interview 5 or 6 years ago, which then I thought was hilarious. And then saw the film for the first time at BAM in the movie theater. It's the only John Cassavetes film I've seen on the big screen.
Like a year ago?
Year and a half. Summer of Trump was not in office.
So it was a good summer.
2016. Yeah, it was a better
so
summer.
So much hope in the air.
There was a lot going on. And then I saw the film, was pretty blown away by it. Actually kept the ticket stub, which is not something I'm not nostalgic in that way, but I have the ticket stub.
I still have all my Star Wars ticket stubs from the re-releases.
Oof.
I know.
Yeah, I don't know if that's great.
I thought we had to be honest on this podcast, so I'm just trying to be myself.
No, it's good. I don't want you to not be you. And then watched the Dick Cavett interview again, and was simultaneously found it hilarious and really disturbing in our age of puffed up, toxic masculinity, and specifically with this movie because I think there's a simultaneous. I'd like to hope there's a simultaneous self-aware quality to what they're doing, but clearly a lot of joy in what they're doing.
And the debauchery.
And actually, I was looking at the Metrograph website recently, which is a theater here in New York, and this is one of their essential films. This is their John Cassavetes essential film that they screen with Cassavetes, and there's a line about it being a line between performance and reality, which is really something we can talk about. And especially like later, let's say from here on out, there's an element of performance being a part of every John Cassavetes movie with, I don't know about Minnie and Moskowitz, but Killing of a Chinese Bookie has a kind of self-awareness with him being a club manager, and opening night has Ben Gazzara, who's, in Husbands. And
right, but this is also interesting because this is the first time Cassavetes directed himself on film.
Yeah, I realized this is the first time besides his shadowy appearance in Shadows.
Right.
that we were.
Nice pun there.
Thank you. I'm
Planning that?
I'm literate.
Shut
I got to
up,
bed
here.
about 2:30, but that's because I was carousing.
Well, yeah, it's because we were on that flight coming back from London, right? So maybe we should be.
Beer.
Oh, so good.
So
at
I'm very
9:30 in the
interested
morning.
in this movie.
So maybe we should begin with the tagline: a comedy about life, death, and freedom.
So before you jump in there,
Oh, sorry.
I wanted
really
to
quickly.
say this: slow
Please.
down.
Just please.
This was the first John Cassavetes movie that I started watching that I did not dread when I pressed play. I was looking
you mean even
forward
before?
to rewatching it.
Oh, to rewatching it.
But yes, a comedy, which I circled, about life, death, and freedom.
So this is a comedy, kind of like how this podcast is a comedy podcast.
You mean it's not funny?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay,
So
just
well,
wanted to
actually,
be
so
sure.
did you at any point laugh?
Yes.
There were some
I
moments of
laughed.
laughter.
I
Yeah,
laughed,
me too.
But I was never comfortable with my laughter, except, well, I don't know if that's true.
That's not true.
I find Peter Falk generally hilarious.
Yeah, there's some scenes which were just the three of them where they're just being kind of friendly to one another and they're like slapping each other on the back and like running through New York City.
Like right now on
Yeah.
our TV. We have the film running in the background.
Or where they're doing that kind of ridiculous, you know, they're well obviously we should just quickly kind of go through the plot, or we will go through the plot, but when they're doing these kind of like feats of strength where they're playing basketball or like swimming in the pool, and it's so absurd and it's so stupid, and those moments are absurd and hilarious in that kind of sense.
So the movie is about four friends, and we should say there's four friends because
Ooh.
although there are
Ghost of
three
Stewart.
characters that make up the film, it's a movie about four people, one of whom who's almost entirely absent. It's about three friends whose fourth friend Stephen
Stewart. So
Stewart.
Gus is Cassavetes.
Yeah, we have Gus,
Harry,
and Archie.
Archie.
Though if you pay close attention, you can hear John Cassavetes calling Ben Gazzara Ben throughout.
Really?
Yeah.
That is
A few
amazing. I did
times you
not
hear him be
catch
like, "Hey
that.
Ben," and you're like, "Come on, man." But they're three friends, Archie, Gus, and Harry, and the death of their friend Stewart sends them on a week-long binge drinking sort of tangent intermixed with sports and womanizing
and gambling.
gambling
You
and
gotta
some
have gambling in
horrible
there.
domestic abuse and physical and emotional.
Because it's a Cassavetes film, there
violence.
has to be violence against women. So the film begins with these still shots of their lives together, the four friends, of what seems to be like a family kind of
It's family gathering. There's
gathering.
sound effects in the background. It's interesting that the first images you see in a movie called Husbands are the children and the wives.
Yeah.
And gradually it builds. So you see pictures of the wives. You see Jenna Rowlands figures is one of the figures.
in the pictures.
But
And it's really interesting
go
because
ahead.
sorry, one of the interesting photos or a series of sequences is them with their shirts off, kind of posing
with
muscle,
almost
like
all
making
of the
muscle
photos
arms.
of them making muscle
Yeah,
arms.
which also begins, and we'll talk about this too, kind of the homoeroticism in this film, which is just it's saturated.
Yeah, very.
with
It's a
homoeroticism.
interesting movie to look through the
Homosociality,
lens
to use a fancy
of
word.
queer. Don't throw your credentials at me. It's sort of a queer element. Before we jump in, I read a little bit of. We're going to chat a little bit about. George has a book report later in the episode, but I read a little bit of
Stay tuned.
Ray Carney's Cassavetes on Cassavetes interview on his website. Ray Carney's a BU professor and kind of a firebrand, a little controversial, and he said that they took 6 months to shoot this movie, which is a crazy amount of time.
That is a crazy
And
amount of time.
because of the success of Faces, he was given a definite distribution deal and final cut.
But didn't he also make this so he can get money to finish Faces?
Yeah, he took the
so he signed
initial
a deal.
$25,000 for two movies, one of which never got made, about Mexican immigrants.
Huh,
Yeah,
I don't remember
he
reading that.
spent 10 years on it, didn't actually want to make, but packaged it to make the money
Wow.
to finish Faces. So
Back in the good old days when $25,000 could get you a film.
yeah, now it only can get you a podcast,
One of those
episode.
one of those red digital cameras. what the
Yeah,
fuck they're
exactly.
called.
So yeah, there's this photo montage of the muscles, very repetitive.
Oh wait, can I also say one more thing about the original casting? Did you
Yes,
read that
Anthony
about
Quinn,
and Lee Marvin?
Lee Marvin. That's who the other one was.
Should have been
They
a
didn't
very
like each
different
other.
film.
Very different film. I'm not sure it would have been as good of a film. I think that those two guys are probably a little too abrasive
I agree.
for this film to really click.
So the film begins with these, again, as we said, these still shots of this family gathering, and then it quickly cuts after maybe about 2 or 3 minutes of these shots to the funeral.
A
Stewart's
funeral.
yeah.
Stewart's funeral. Stewart is the fourth character that sort of hangs over the film. And we watch them. It's very, very so. First, like, there's a very the little of the film takes place in suburbia, but the scenes that do take place in suburbia are dead on suburbia.
Yes.
Like, this funeral is everyone's in a peacoat, big black cars. Which, I mean, I didn't grow up in Port Washington where this was filmed, but I mean, that's the place that I grew up. There's a really great divide between the Port Washington, Long Island stuff and the city stuff and then the eventual London stuff. But it feels like such a suburban funeral.
Those final shots, too, which obviously we'll get to, but when they return to suburbia are really kind of soul-crushing. It's winter. The gardens are, like, dead.
Right.
It's very, very fitting for where this kind of film ends up.
So it opens with them sort of they arrive at the funeral. They seem to be late to the funeral.
Possibly.
And they have an old...
Stewart ain't going anywhere, am I right?
They have an old...
Dead people don't move. No.
Dead people don't move. A new
stay
collection of short stories coming from George Fragopoulos.
I was going to say, that sounds almost like what James Franco would call his,
God.
his next short story
Don't bring him up here.
Keep him outside.
So they arrive at the funeral with someone's mother. I don't think it's Stewart's
Someone's
mother.
mother.
Is it Stewart's? The first time I watched the film, but that doesn't make sense because
Why?
she's super late. Why isn't she with Stewart's wife, who's already there? I mean, it doesn't really matter. But what's interesting about this open scene is you have Ben Gazzara playing Harry, walking with who might be probably Stewart's mother, and Peter Falk and John Cassavetes walking behind them. And right off the gate, I feel like Peter Falk comes off as the sort of nervous, anxious member of the group. Ben Gazzara actually comes off as the most responsible, sort of the most kind of on point. He's escorting the mom. Peter Falk is saying really kind of weird, troubling things.
Existential stuff. Like,
Existential
something
stuff.
really
Don't
humiliating
believe
about
truth.
death.
Yeah, is death humiliating?
No, I thought he said only believe in truth. I thought he said lies will kill you.
Yeah, but Cassavetes says don't believe truth.
Oh.
So there's this really self-indulgent conversation, and Ben Gazzara looks back at them in a shot that quite doesn't match, and he's like, "What the fuck
are you guys doing?
And
they're smoking.
Yeah, like give me a cigarette. Give me a cigarette. And so right off the bat,
by the way, I've been working on my Peter Falk, and that's the best I could kind of come off the top of my head.
Give me a cigarette. I can't. That's hard.
That's not
hard. Yeah, that's not Peter Falk.
Give me a cigarette.
And you feel like right off the gate, after they attend this funeral, which is, you know, sort of a typical, there's these shots of them kind of cutting through the crowd, walking up to the front of the funeral, and they have a moment at the casket with the widow, we should say. And we immediately cut to a car, and then we get a sense of their dynamics, and it feels to me...
And they're leaving the funeral.
That sort of they view Gus as the leader of the group. Like,
he's kind of like the midpoint between the other two in terms of kind of temperament.
Which is interesting because in a way, if you were to watch the first 10 minutes of this film, and this is something that relates to faces, you might be convinced that John Cassavetes' character Gus is the only decent, or is probably the most upstanding, responsible leader kind of, or like the leader of the group. He's tempering their feelings about each other.
The film deconstructs that though, because by the end they're all awful human beings.
So they're in the cab, and
it doesn't take you long to figure out that they're all awful human beings, by the way.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what's interesting is that there's moments of tenderness. Like Ben Gazzara has his second to last scene in the movie is like a really, really beautiful, very short moment. But they're in the cab, and Peter Falk is like, I didn't like that funeral. I didn't like it. And Ben Gazzara is ranting about something, and then he says, I'm going to get very, very drunk.
I don't want to go home.
I don't want to go home. I'm not going home. I'm going to get very, very drunk. And then we smash cut, and they're in New York City, and they are drunk, and they are outside, and they are just running around, being goofs. Reminded me of the first scene of Shadows.
Yeah.
You know, just these guys on the street in New York, and
I did love
12 years after Shadows.
I did love the exterior shots of early 70s New York.
It was nice to have exterior shots of a John Cassavetes movie after fucking Faces. Yeah. And they're drunk, and they're running around, and then they're in the subway.
They're palling around.
And I think they really...
Did you notice how clean the subway was? I'm like, what the fuck was this
clean.
filmed in one of our
I had to wonder if that was a...
beautiful subway.
That was the real subway. It must have been.
Yeah, it seemed that way to me. Although it was odd that that scene lasts like a good minute and there's no stops.
Yeah, there's no stops. and then they make a decision to get off the train,
So maybe it wasn't a real subway car because
And then
A,
he's
it was
like,
too
we're 40
clean.
stops away.
Yeah, they go like 2 or 3 minutes without hitting a stop, and there's nobody else on that car, which obviously you could still do. But I don't know. It was like 1970s New York.
Yeah.
It's like this subway car should be a lot more grimy.
Yeah, and
Which
so
I'm all for, by the way. I love a good grimy subway car.
No, it's definitely yeah. Well,
As a
sure,
true New
but
Yorker.
But a New Yorker.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of this brief scene by scene montage of them drunk. The next scene, they're running down the street. They're running to an athletic club, and a thought occurred to me at this moment.
Well, wait, hold on, because they have this really interesting conversation also about the fact that they're no longer young in the subway car.
That's right.
Start talking about like being
35,
athletes.
your legs go.
Yeah.
And as a 35-year-old, I don't think that's true.
I thought he said 30, but yeah, no, he says
35.
35. You're
Well,
right,
they're
yeah.
all. I
Cassavetes-
looked it up. Falk is 43.
Yeah, they're older than the
Ben
characters. that seem to be
Gazzara
playing.
is 40. No, but Cassavetes was like 40.
Right, but I think don't you think in the film they're like in their mid 30s?
No, I think they're supposed to be.
They are
40.
supposed to be in their
Yeah,
40s?
Yeah, I
Uh-huh.
think so. No way are they in their mid 30s. If they're in their mid 30s, then like, those are the oldest.
Dude,
like if they're our age, then like we're fucked.
We're taking a lot better care. We don't drink or smoke like they do, though.
Yeah, that's true. We don't. That's. I mean, I hope we don't.
But they have this really interesting
Is
conversation.
this a cry for help, George?
It could
I
be.
almost called you John. John.
Sure, are we gonna, method podcasting, man. That's where it's at.
Ooh.
Fuck.
Terrible. You're terrible.
You're terrible.
No passion.
No passion. It's this scene right
on
here.
right here.
Yeah. Wait, hold on. But it's a fascinating, also obviously, conversation that gets to a lot of what this film's about the fact that they feel like they're growing older. They feel that everything's kind of left them behind. But also, Falk goes on this like ridiculous tirade about all the sports he loves. He's like,
basketball. I love basketball.
no, he said he doesn't love basketball.
Oh, that's right.
It's baseball. He's like, I love baseball. I love golf.
I love swimming.
badminton. I love swimming.
That's actually a really funny
It
moment.
is a funny moment. Yeah.
It's really funny.
Hence the comedy
Which
part.
leads them to
The athletic club.
Athletic club. And this was something, when they're running down the street, I thought of something I thought when I showed my wife the first episode of Mad Men. About 30 minutes into the first episode of Mad Men, she was like, I can't tell any of these fucking guys apart. I don't know who they are. I don't remember who's who. And I think the subtext was like, I don't care.
Right.
And I can understand that being the case here. For the first few minutes of this movie, like watching it, I feel like the first time you see it particularly, it's just three really obnoxious dudes. A little bit. Like there's just a quality of being like, at this point, why do I care?
Well, it's
and
funny you
I
should say that too, because
understand that impulse.
We both agree that the first hour of this film is sheer masterpiece
Compared to this, compared to the
second hour.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's oof.
Yeah. Rewatching this, it's funny too because, again, rewatching this, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed the first hour, because I remember at the
end, it flies by.
Yeah, at the end of the film, the first time I watched it, I was like, I'm glad I saw this film. I enjoyed a lot of it, but it's not something that like I would need to come back to. So I think that's where we disagree on this. But then rewatching it, I was like, holy shit, this fucking film's amazing.
Yeah, the first hour is incredible. And then we see them playing, running into the sports club. This is another moment where I was like, are these just a grown-up versions of the guys in Shadows? There's a quality of them being kind of like Dennis and I don't even remember the other guy's name, but
that was like 3 weeks ago for me. Yeah.
Way more.
I don't remember what happened yesterday.
Months ago. It was August.
Yeah, it was, right? It was 2016 before the election.
They play basketball, which I wrote basketball. I wrote the word basketball.
Where the fuck, by the way, do they get all these sweatpants?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, yeah, they kind of end up in sweatpants. They're working out. They're working out hard. They've been drinking for at least today, 24 hours.
It's been at this. Well, no,
it says that we've been awake for 36 hours or something like that.
No, not at that point, because that would mean that by the time they get to London, they've been awake for like 4 days. The timing of this is interesting.
It's a couple days.
So maybe. So wait, hold on. After the funeral, they're on the subway. Oh yeah. Okay, it's the next morning. You're right.
And then they go to play basketball.
So it's been at least 24 hours. They play basketball. Gazzara at the beginning is like running around in his suit and in his like dress shoes, trying to keep up with them. But like,
and then he's all of a sudden in sweats.
Yeah, and then the scene cuts. They're in sweats, and then they take a swim in the pool.
Right, they swim in the pool.
There's a bit of horsing around in the pool.
Exactly. So you're
again,
sort of
very
seeing all this,
homoerotic.
and there's a conversation about competition. When they're sort of playing these sports, and what's his name? Peter Falk has the comment about how he's really into competition.
And Harry says what's the point
of competition?
Yeah.
And so there's sort of this you get establishing these relationships. It's interesting. There's a real, maybe this is one of those interesting things with Cassavetes where he's less into character being a total picture and more like a state case of contradiction, because Peter Falk earlier in the movie seems like a nervous kind of ninny. If that's a pro, I don't even know where that. I think my mom used to say that.
No, I think ninny is the.
Ninny is.
I think the kids these days are.
They love the term ninny.
ninny.
And then later on,
describe.
he's like very competitive, and Peter Falk is, or sorry, Ben Gazzara is kind of like, what's the point of competition? But that does not stay consistent with where Ben Gazzara's character starts to go a little bit in this movie.
That's interesting. But in what specific way? In
Well,
terms of like competition?
Yeah, well, he just becomes... So we should probably talk about the next scene
The bar
after
scene.
they go swimming, which is, I think, probably the best scene in the entire film.
And also the first really uncomfortable scene.
Debatable. But yeah, we then cut to this sort of like this kind of centerpiece, or like the first sort of like, if this film has a, or if any of Cassavetes' films have kind of like a, what do you call it? Like a centerpiece, or like, you know, sort of a big, like it's like the equivalent of an action scene for a John Cassavetes movies. There's a scene where they are very drunk.
Surprisingly.
They're
at,
and around
we don't know
a
where they
table,
are.
we know they're in a bar somewhere probably in Midtown, with a group of people who
appear
are
out of nowhere.
that are
There's
older
no-
than them.
There's no context.
And they are the people around the table they're going around the table. John Cassavetes, Ben Gazzara, and Peter Falk are going around the table and getting them to sing songs and then critiquing the performance of their songs. And I wrote down a note that I've already written down in relationship to this, which is, no one drinks like they drink in a John Cassavetes
That's
film.
true.
They're pounding beer. I gotta believe they're doing some real drinking.
Yeah.
At least the beers are real.
This is like the darkest episode of American Idol you've ever seen.
It's, yeah. So they're going around and they're all singing. People are singing like different songs. One woman sings, "I dream of Jeannie with the light
Call back to,
brown
Faces.
hair."
Oh, you have been practicing.
Thank you. Thank
You
you very
nailed that.
much.
Can we just end the podcast right here and now? It's never going to be better than that.
This is a very different movie when you watch it at home than when you watch it in the theater. In the theater, this scene felt endless and painful. At home, it was a little funny.
It is a little bit funny. Yeah, there are those moments again because it's like so absurd. But the way at some point, so they go around the table and they're kind of, some people sing well, or at least according to them. And
Pretty well.
And then they get to this one woman who's singing.
The older woman.
The older woman. And they just berate this woman. And it begins with a Gazzara.
Terrible.
Terrible.
No passion.
Terrible. No passion. I was getting flashbacks to grad school, by the way. I was like, oh, this reminds me of some classes I've been in or been yelled at.
Did you go to grad school with Ben Gazzara?
Which is weird, too. I like, took
he
him
was
from...
like, I'm getting my MFA in writing.
I took him from Melville, and he's like, well, why are you teaching this class? It makes no fucking sense. Like, what do you have to say about Melville?
And he was like, plenty. This is one of this is probably the first scene in the movie where you're like, there's something so monstrous.
Because they all take turns berating this woman and yelling at her.
And everyone, and Peter Falk tries to take his clothes off.
Yeah, Peter Falk, he says something like, oh, sing better and I'll take my clothes off. And he does. He actually does take his clothes off. But you don't see anything, obviously, but he takes his clothes off.
No, and it's very humiliating. But there's something so appealing on a basic level about like the behaving badly. Like, it's interesting how, I don't know, it's not appealing in like a man, it'd be great to treat people terribly, but there's also something a little, I don't know,
because they're bonding.
Yeah, and just like there's something appealing about like being drunk and acting goofy, but it crosses a line because it's terrible behavior.
So like, this is why.
Let me just have a big swig of this beer.
This is why. Oh, it's so
Such
good.
a man.
Yeah, this is why I feel like
I dream of Jeannie with.
Liam got to control himself. Oh no, God, he's passed out. I'm gonna have to put Marty Scorsese on the mic, and he hasn't said anything.
Hello!
He hasn't said anything in 4 episodes.
Well, he's tied up. You have a gag in his ball gag in his mouth.
Marty,
Release
get back in the
the
dungeon. So these are the moments in the film where I'm like, is he in fact critiquing the shittiness of his own characters?
I don't know. Then that might,
or just not like having fun.
At the risk of sounding like the worst guy in your MFA program,
James Franco,
is there Is there some
Franco,
James
is that you?
Franco loves this movie unironically? Is there something powerful and provocative and not commenting on the behavior, but by creating such a
Correct.
by
displaying it for
such
us.
a clear picture of like toxic behavior, is that a comment on the behavior? And I think that this is something to think about when we talk about the Cassavetes and pragmatism
Yes.
in the book that you're going to book report. That let's get there. We should weave it into, but I feel like we should get to the plot of this film.
I feel like Carney. We're not discussing the plot. I feel like Carney.
Once we get through it,
I feel like this is where Carney and I am in our agreement. There's a lot in the book that I'm in agreement with, but where he suggests that these films aren't didactic and they're not obviously attempting to like twist your arm in very specific ways.
That's interesting because I think that there's a scene in this movie that is incredibly didactic, and I wonder if you know which scene I'm talking about.
I do not.
Okay,
but I
well,
can't
we'll
wait to
get
get
there.
there. So then we
Remind me if I don't mention it because I didn't take a note about it.
So then we get to my favorite scene actually, which is the bathroom scene, and then so it cuts.
Amazing scene.
They're in the bathroom. It's Cassavetes and Falk. They're in the stall. Falk, Archie, is puking his brains out.
Why is he puking?
I wonder why.
No.
Oh, like seriously, why is he puking? I don't know.
So there's I don't want to jump on your thing, but
Please do.
there's a interview with Cassavetes
Mhm.
in which he's hang on.
Is that beer coming back up?
It's just gassy. There's a scene in I should have belched on the mic and not
Should've.
commented on it. There's a scene in the movie. We're gonna run out of seltzers. There's a interview with
Don't you mean
Cassavetes.
Miller Lite?
I mean, sorry. Should we? Okay. There's a
You
scene.
can always edit that out.
There's an interview where John Cassavetes says they're not puking because they're drunk. They're puking from grief.
Wow, deep
And there were huge walkouts when this movie premiered
because of that.
because they walked out during this scene.
Question: do you think? I mean,
Hang on, let me just get some more Miller Lite.
at some point, just gonna continue.
I'm sorry.
burping
That's,
into the
I have to
microphone.
cut all this out. This is my vomit scene.
At some point, I was like, "Huh? Are we also supposed to assume that they've taken copious amounts of drugs, and that hasn't been
I don't know.
like that wouldn't have been something that he wouldn't have."
no,
would've shied
I
away
think
from.
that they're that. So that's an interesting thing to think about in relation to them as, men in the time that they lived, because I think that they're probably fundamentally conservative guys who probably like would have voted like pro maximum penalty for like
Pro
like.
Hey, did you vote pro
No,
maximum
but what I
penalty
mean when
at
I
the
say
ballot?
that is I think
Definitely.
that these are guys that would probably be like disgusted by
These guys-
drug use, but like exempt themselves from that.
like that guy in Too Late Blues, that thug in the bar.
Yeah.
Where he's
Oh,
like,
this.
these
yeah.
musicians are out there doing needles and heroin.
It's terrible.
So they have this really, really fascinating conversation. I brought the full brunt of my philosophical knowledge on this, and I wrote, sickness unto death, because they have this really interesting conversation. So basically, Falk pukes, and Cassavetes is revolted, and there's this really great scene where he's like obviously talking about the vomit, but he's like, there, it's on your foot. But it just kind of reminded me, it was just kind of, for me, a kind of really interesting confrontation with mortality, that there's this kind of like sense
Yes,
in which,
he becomes
like,
very upset.
yeah, they're really, I mean, they're watching like their bodies disintegrate in the form of like them being sick in the stall and like
Abuse.
yeah, but then there's also all like these really interesting kind of conversations. Like they keep talking about how bad they smell for a good like half hour of this film.
Yeah, it's a big part of the movie.
So it's this. I read it as this really kind of interesting critique of their bodily disintegration. So like
Interesting.
there's all this like talk of like, oh, I'm not the same athlete I was like 20 years ago. Oh, like I stink like a fucking corpse. I mean, they don't say like a fucking corpse.
There's
but
also a masculine thing. So they're
they're like out of control.
40.
They're losing.
Yeah, my father was probably born around the same time as these guys. Hard drinker, and probably of a culture of people that were like, well, I'll work out and it's fine. I don't have to take care. I can just work. I can sweat it out playing basketball or swimming or whatever the case might be. This is an interesting scene because the bathroom scene, because it sets up an interesting dynamic where you have Cassavetes playing. You have Gus and Cassavetes. I'm not referring to their character names. Gus and Harry. Gus and
Archie.
Archie, Peter Falk and John Cassavetes having a moment, and lingering outside like a goddamn animal
Yeah.
is Ben Gazzara. And you feel this is
Like
the
a
first time you
prowling
have a
beast.
sense of like a bro triangle.
Oh yeah, because he walks in and he's like, "You guys talking about me?"
Yeah,
He's
what
like,
do
I know
you
you guys have secrets.
Yeah, what are you doing? And he becomes very angry. And it's interesting how, coming back to the scene before, there's a moment in the earlier scene where there's a threat of violence. Someone throws a glass.
Yeah.
And Ben Gazzara is very quick to be like, there's not going to be any violence here.
He shuts it down.
Which is an interesting thing to consider when we're about 3 scenes later in the film.
That's a good point.
But there's an establishment of Ben Gazzara as kind of a jealous, kind of petty, and very, very kind of threatened by
the two of them
and their relationship. And there's a moment in the film where, and this is really tough. It's actually on screen right now. Peter Falk goes like, "You fawn over your wife, you go to your job, whatever," and then he says to Ben Gazzara, "Harry, you're a phony," and he loses his mind. Ben Gazzara loses his mind. He says the worst thing to be called is a phony.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, and John Cassavetes would say that he had no interest in narrative, but I think all of his narrative beats impulsively come from character, and he doesn't embed story in that. But you have to wonder that how much that moment springboards the rest of the film, because Ben Gazzara's character ends the film in a very, very different place than the other two men.
Totally. And do you want to
literally?
Yeah. And we also, like, briefly before we started recording, talked about, again, not just like the homoeroticism of the film, but like doing a kind of, or suggesting like a queer kind of reading of these characters. Excuse me, in the sense that
this lager we're drinking is just making us gassy.
You said that, like, so Gazzara, it might be like a closeted gay man, and there's an interesting moment too in this. Just
the next scene,
right, where he turns to them and he's like, "Oh, I love you guys." He's like, and at some point I just wrote, even I think before the scene, I was like, "Wow, these guys love each other. They're like constantly grabbing each other.
Very touchy.
It's such a fascinating film in terms of the way you can read it against their kind of like traditional masculine roles.
And in the scene that follows the bathroom scene where they're back in the bar and they sort of reconciled a little bit, Gazzara goes and makes a phone call and then smashes the window of the phone booth that he's in.
And that's like first scene violence.
First scenes where he's violent, but also he has a line where he says, he puts his arm around Falk and he puts his arm around Cassavetes and he says, "You know, guys, aside from sex, which my wife is very good at, I like you guys better."
I like you guys better, yeah. Which is an
it
amazing line.
It may seem incredibly obvious, but it's 1970s and these are very, very hetero men.
Yeah.
Playing
Heteronormative
men playing these characters. It might not be subtle. I didn't pick it up the first time. I think Harry is... Ben Gazzara's character is a closeted gay man.
Yeah.
Might not even know it, but there's something he's repressed in like a very. I don't want to assign that because I don't.
You don't want to overdetermine it.
I also don't want to determine. And I also don't want to like equate like his inherent violence with like or that idea that he's violent or whatever with that. But there's something in his heteronormativity that does not sit well with him, and I think it could be that he's closeted. He's a closeted gay man.
Yeah.
And then in the next scene, which is back in Port Washington, when Harry goes back to his house, I think to go to work, to get changed to go to work, he has a line with his wife where he talks about being in a closet.
I just don't want to be in the closet.
Yeah, which seems incredibly obvious. But like, what else could that... I don't know what else it could refer to. He's not being poetic. This isn't a film of poetic language, really.
Well, I mean, it's not a film of poetic language.
Well, it doesn't. What I mean to say is that it's not like he's being metaphorical in that moment or being.
Well, it's funny you should say that too, because again, there's like so many, and this is okay. So going back to the Carney book, this is another issue I have with the Carney book, and this has come up before in our podcast.
It's not the time for the book report, George.
Sorry. Where there's so much dialogue.
Is there any more beer?
There's so much. No, but I do have more La Croix.
Do you?
Yeah.
You mean Miller
Pamplemousse? No. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Miller High Life.
The champagne of beers.
This episode brought to you by La Croix.
The champagne of seltzer. There is... the Carney book. Where so much of the language reads as if it's inflected by a certain kind of 50s, 60s existentialism.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Which also, I guess, if you were doing because you were trying to maybe reference, I don't know, like film noir or something.
Yeah, well, I don't know what I was referencing, except that there's like a clipped quality to the language.
Like
and all
Fox says, like, in the bathroom scene, it's not the sickness. I can live with that.
So is that like a nausea?
Yeah, or like
Paul
a Beckett kind of thing, where again in the beginning when they're talking about the funeral or Stubart's funeral, Fox says something along the lines of, "Oh, it's so humiliating to be dead." There's these really
That's a very yeah.
Yeah,
That has an absurd quality.
There's this kind of like absurd quality to it, and I think that's also where the Carney book kind of fails, because I feel like the
not book report time.
historical tradition from which he's drawing from is kind of off.
Interesting. I really want to hear more about that. I'm curious. I'm wondering if
Listen to my book report podcast.
Welcome to George Report. The George Report.
It really hurt.
I would listen to that.
The George
podcast,
Report.
The George Report.
Can I just, by the way, also briefly say that I walked by a stoop here in the Slope, and I saw somebody who had left out a copy of that old magazine George by
I don't know
John
that
Kennedy
magazine.
Jr.
Oh, George. Yes, I do remember.
It ran
that.
for maybe like 6 issues back in the early 90s. And you know who was on the cover? It was amazing. Or not on the cover himself, but there was an article in there written by Norman Mailer.
Oh my God.
I was like, holy shit, does that date itself?
That really does.
So they go back to Harry's house because
he's going to go to work. They've decided to go back to work. They've decided to go at the end of the scene in the bar. They're like, "Oh, let's go back to work. Let's like go. You're going to go to work." And so this is when it's revealed that Cassavetes is a dentist.
I knew it right from the beginning. I could tell.
And Ben Gazzara is an architect.
It looks like he might be an
There's a drafting table. But I don't know. It's never made
drafting
clear.
Business plans.
He's drafting business plans. So they go back to Port Washington. And Harry goes into his house, and his mother-in-law is there, and he doesn't know where his wife is. And
he's looking for his passport.
Well, he's not yet.
Oh, correct.
So what happens is they go back to the house in a green cab, and he's like, 10 minutes. We're gonna get on the Amtrak or whatever and we're gonna head back to the city. It's gonna be great. And what happens is he doesn't see his wife. He has a brief conversation with his mother about how he's done nothing wrong, essentially. And then he comes outside and he sees Peter Falk and John Cassavetes sitting there, and he has a moment where he decides he's going to, you can tell he's like, "I'm leaving because I love these men more than I love my wife."
That's a good reading of it.
Yeah. I mean, it took me, I didn't rewatch it, but I kind of paused. I was like, what was that moment about? It's about him realizing.
Well, the initial subtext, though, is that they're kind of looking at him in a shameful sort of way, right? Good God.
Man.
Liam, I was only joking about us raging during this podcast. It seems like you took it seriously.
So much Miller Lite.
It seems like it's... Welcome to Liam's last podcast as he dies slowly.
This is the final episode of this show.
Yeah. Although what he'll do for ratings is, I mean, it's commendable.
I'm wasted.
So
ratings.
So the ratings. So they, I guess the initial, not the subtext, but at least the way I read the scene is that they're looking at him in a kind of shameful way of like, "Oh, why don't you confront your wife?" Because or also before they go into the house, don't they say
you think
something
they
to
want him to confront his wife?
Don't they say something to him about like, "Oh, or maybe I'm just thinking about the previous scene at the bar about like his
Well, they
phoniness.
do kind of emasculate him.
Yeah, because because when they're walking up to the house and it's just Cassavetes and Falk, they say something along the lines of like, "Oh, when I'm talking to my woman, I just lay down the law."
Yeah, that's awful. That's an awful. Yeah.
So I thought maybe there was the context was like, "Oh, we told him like you go in there like just say like, hey, I'm out fucking raging."
Yeah, that's right. Because they think he sort of like fawns over her and doesn't. He's a little too concerned with what she thinks.
So he walks out, he sees them again, and then he walks back in, and then she, the wife, is at the breakfast table with the mother-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where, it gets kind of awful.
It gets awful because, in a way...
When he goes for his passport.
He's emasculated a little bit because so there's a couple interesting things. One, there's a scene where he goes outside to leave to go to work, sees them, goes back inside, and his wife is there. And there's also a moment where he ties his tie without thinking about it. Like he just kind of does it without any and it's a little later, but it speaks to me this character is like this is the repressed conformist product of a 50s, 60s upbringing.
That's a good point.
This is not the life he wanted.
It's like going just through the motions.
Exactly. Doesn't want to be violent, and then gets into a confrontation with his wife, who pulls out a knife. And she says something like, "I can't look at you. I'm disgusted by you."
And he keeps trying to get her to say that she loves him.
Yeah, and you have to wonder if this is like because she assumes he's cheated on her, or maybe he's cheated on her like with a man. Like there's just a lot hanging in the air and a lot of it open to interpretation, but I can't get away from the idea that like she
knows,
sort of assumes or knows that he's, and like they've maintained like a steady peace. She's also clearly much younger than he is. And there's a joke here about getting your Bahama underwear
That's
that
right.
John Cassavetes or Peter Falk makes.
That's in the train ride afterwards, I believe.
Right.
Isn't it?
It's I have it. Yeah, that is. But
Bahama
it's
underwear?
just there's this feeling that
Not Google
there's
that.
a feeling that they're poking fun at him for things that are unclear. Anyway,
like an inside joke.
Or like, but see, I tried to like, is this some kind of, I don't know. I became very obsessed with Harry as the guy who, there's something very wrong in this guy, the way that this guy has chosen to live his life.
Well, he's also, and we discussed this the first time that I saw this, and I guess at first the first time I saw this, it was more taken in by Fox performance.
He's incredible.
He's incredible.
We should say that they're all
incredible.
And throughout, even with the second half of the film, I think it's Ben Gazzara's performance in this and Killing of a Chinese Bookie are like two of the best performances.
No, every time Gazzara's on the screen,
he's absolutely amazing. And he's so in it and he's so present.
So this is when they decide to go to London. And this is when the film, just for me at least, kind of goes south.
So let's pause here because it's worth taking through the motions. He goes back, Gazzara goes outside, attending to go to work, sees Cassavetes, sees Falk, has this moment of tenderness, walks back inside, sees his wife, tries to get her to say she loves him. She doesn't say it, or she's disgusted by him. He goes upstairs, gets his passport, and then comes back downstairs and sort of tries to like make out with his wife, who pushes him away, which results in this like
awful
really
scene.
Violent scene.
Yeah.
She pulls a knife. He hits her.
He hits both of them.
He hits his mother-in-law and his wife, and it's. That's that you feel a moment of like real. The film really sinks.
Yeah,
and
it's a terrible scene.
what up till that point had been bearable and in times quite funny. And this isn't the didactic moment in the film for me, but there's a quality to this where it really becomes unacceptable. And it not only becomes unacceptable for the audience, but it becomes unacceptable for Cassavetes and Falk, who come in and like pull him out of the house. And I think that, they're sort of like, yeah, don't let your lady tell you what to do is one thing. Very problematic. But the next step is the like,
of course, yeah. To
your
have
domestic
that turn to
abuser.
violence. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes on for a while, and it's he like chokes his mother-in-law. He hits them. It's a really the cuts of it are really terrible to watch, and it sets the movie on this new trajectory. I'm pretty sure he would have killed them if Cassavetes and Falk don't show up. Like it's that level of kind of like terror and rage and
yeah, it's bad. And he's like climbing up the stairs trying to get to.
And if it all seems to come from this repressed, alienated life that this guy is living, which feels incredibly timely for the time when this film was made, 1970.
You mean in the sense that it's kind of progressive in this like of its critique of how terrible suburban domesticity can be?
Yeah, and I also think like a guy like this is never going to be subject to
any repercussions
because of his privilege and who he is.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's interesting that Cassavetes chooses to, in his early film, kind of highlight a racial struggle and an artistic struggle. And from Faces on, at least for these two films, there's a kind of like the plight of the middle to upper class businessman kind of. Yeah. The plight. The plight. But that seems to be one way to look at it. If you read these movies seriously,
correct.
He has sympathy for them, but there's something else going on.
He does have sympathy for them. And it's really interesting because there is this kind of sense in which he's very, very up for critiquing, for example, again, these like traditional roles. But in other kind of ways, he's really much about championing being a champion for other forms of like traditional masculinity, like the great like male genius artist, for example.
So do you think he's championing the idea of the male genius?
Yes, artist.
Right.
But in other ways, he's totally down for kind of showing or suggesting that, hey, if you're a businessman, your life is fucking shit. Why?
Right.
Because you're just about making a deal, or it's just all about business, and you're totally co-opted. You've totally sold out. You have no soul.
I think it goes deeper than
He says that
though.
also. He says that also in one of the interviews where he's on Cassavetes, where I think he says kind of like, oh, well, what do? You find yourself, you're in middle age. You have the wife, you have the house, you have the kids, you have the car, you have the garages, but it's all meaningless.
And this comes back to a choice between life, death, and freedom.
Correct.
And the challenges or what that means for the
Which
film.
again sounds like such a kind of existentialist.
It feels a little. It
tagline.
feels a little dated.
It does. I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm saying of its time. And again, this is why I have an issue with the Carney book, because that kind of tradition, which he's clearly borrowing from, at least in my eyes, or is just not being discussed in that book as much as I think it should be.
Is he? Do you? So okay.
And I should also be fair to this book because I didn't read the entirety of it. I only read about maybe 100 pages from it.
It's a lot of pages of that book.
It's a lot of pages.
So let's move quickly through the next few scenes.
They go to London.
They get on a train.
Go on train
To go into the city. Cassavetes and Falk stink. This is an interesting moment
Gazzara
because
points it out.
Gazzara points it over, but also you can see Gazzara having some regrets. He's really irritated. He's angry. He's sort of set himself free, like he's not going back to his wife in any conventional scene.
When he has that scene, that crushing scene with the woman where he says that, like, my heart's breaking.
Yeah.
And I feel so disloyal.
And then we go to the dentist office, and we have
this is kind of a funny scene.
Yeah, John Cassavetes with this woman. Again, one of the only female characters in the film that's not a sex object for the men.
Hysterical.
And she's hysterical, and it's kind of, I mean, to be honest, it's funny, but it's also really stupid, and it feels really unnecessary to have this woman who's like, oh, I'm really scared of the dentist.
Well,
and
the
Falk is stalking around trying to talk to Cassavetes,
which is what I found. That was the funniest part of the scene, where Falk is in the dentist, like right next to the dentist chair, while Gus is trying to do something, and he's just kind of like sitting there chilling. And if like I was in this chair, I'd be like, can that guy get the fuck out of here?
Yeah, it's just a weird scene. And also, it's one of the few scenes from Cassavetes where I think he takes the easy way out. He ends the scene without having
It is a weird
him
scene.
deal with how to just walk out of the room, because he just leaves. He eventually just, it cuts away before we know how he deals with this hysterical woman. Like, he clearly wants out. It's very strange. It's one of the first indications that I think the movie loses a thread a little bit.
Well, it's one of those scenes that just could have been cut.
Right. Which, I mean, there's and it's also I don't know if it's an issue, but there's a question of point of view in this film. Because up to now it feels like it's been about Harry. Harry's really irritated and upset on the train. They get to the city, they're fighting, they're arguing. It feels like a split, and Falk goes with Cassavetes. And we don't see Gazzara for a scene, and there's this crazy dentist
But that's
scene.
interesting because it often is, again, like the two of them, Falk and Cassavetes, and Gazzara, not obviously that he isn't part of the dynamic, but that he is kind of on the margin. So again, there's a scene at the very beginning of the funeral where it's only the two of them walking. There's the scene, the bathroom scene, two of them walking. And I think that obviously kind of like prefigures what happens later at the end of the film, where Harry gets left behind.
Right.
And Falk and Cassavetes return to their domestic hells. So they go to London.
Right, they're in London.
Get on this
really
plane.
really quick.
Yes, please.
We have a scene at Ben Gazzara's office.
Yeah.
And there's Fred Draper is there.
Fred Draper is there.
Fred Draper from Faces is there. His real name is actually Fred Draper. But there's also this guy who's like, Harry, it's so good to see you.
What was with that?
And that guy, there's something, because I was reading the film through this lens of like, Harry is a repressed gay man. There's something about the way that guy's like, remember the good times we had together? And it's like, is this guy supposed to be John Cassavetes' like two-dimensional portrayal of a gay man? Like, there's something about the way that this sort of strangely dressed Elton John sunglasses wearing kind of guy. Like, again, I don't want to...
much older, too.
I don't want to tread in the stereotype, but like...
Well, but Cassavetes might be trending.
That's my thing, is that I think he's like... He's playing with that a little bit.
There's also this beautiful shot. Did you notice that beautiful shot where like Gazzara's in the foreground of his office, and it's just like 2 or 3 seconds. In the background, in the foreground, there's a picture of his, what you assume is his son. That's like the position of his desk, and it's this kind of like like beautiful moments and some really kind of powerful
And
juxtaposition.
you do not meet Ben Gazzara's kids.
You don't.
The only kids you meet are the Cassavetes
Cassavetes
kids.
kids.
The fucking punk Nick, his real son Nick.
I wanted to punch
Later, a director and
that's right. Yeah,
one of the stars of John Woo's Face Off.
Shit.
He's Dietrich, the bald guy. Who
plays one of the goons, right?
He plays one of the goons. Nick Cassavetes also directed John Q, the Denzel Washington movie, and a few other. She's So Lovely, which was based on a John Cassavetes
Yeah, why the fuck
script.
did I get surprised? I knew he was a director.
They're all directors.
Yeah.
All his kids are directors. Zoe Cassavetes.
So this is our opportunity to just not talk about Face Off, right? So
Oh.
Face Off open on
So we
Doves.
Yeah, we open on a carousel. And a mustachioed Nicolas Cage. Another film about toxic masculinity.
The only kind of, basically the only, I mean, not the only kind of Nick Cage, but my favorite version of Nick Cage, the mustachioed.
Have you seen Mandy?
I've not, no.
Fucking
You
amazing.
said it's amazing.
It's great.
So they go to London.
And this is
Check into a hotel room.
I think we're going to need another re-up on drinks
And
because this is where
actually they also take a nap.
they take a nap.
Where they probably at this point have been up for at least 72 hours. And I'm like, where?
They buy a ticket. They fly to London. There's some buyer's remorse on the plane.
And he says something, Gazzara says, like, what's there to worry about in the middle of the Atlantic? What are you worried about?
Also, there's a scene where Cassavetes, before they leave for London, calls his wife and says, like, it's your golden Greek. I need you to get me and Peter Falk's passports. And they get
that
them.
he calls himself his golden Greek.
He calls him. Yeah,
Can
he
you please
keeps,
call me that?
Yeah, yes, golden Greek.
Thank you.
And
It's working.
all of a sudden, we're in London. And originally, the screenplay had them going to 5 different cities. The original version was like London, Rome, Amsterdam, all these different places. But I think budgetarily, they can only afford one. And they seem to shoot the movie in the rainiest goddamn, like, there are sprinklers off camera just pouring rain. It's got to be fake.
It is fake. Well, there's this really interesting, it's only 2 or 3 minutes, interesting clip of Cassavetes directing, I believe, Elaine Cow, or probably mispronouncing her name. But it's obviously it's not raining, but he says to her, like, oh, it's going to be raining, so this is what I want you to do. You're going to be walking towards the cab. It's going to be raining. I want you to just kind of like talk. And it's
right.
It's kind of directing her.
So we get there, and they go to a hotel, and they get 3 adjacent rooms, and then they go gamble. And for me, this is where this movie, the gambling scenes are great, but this movie really starts to
go
downhill. We have the film playing in the background, and we're looking at an earlier moment.
Is this because of your irrational hatred of the English? So like,
oh, you know me. That's 1776, bro.
Just kept texting me during the World Cup. You're like, when are they gonna lose? When are they gonna lose?
This is awful.
Why haven't they lost?
I hate them.
It's a goddamn Wayne Rooney.
So don't know who that is.
I realized it wasn't on this year's World Cup team, but still.
You might as well be speaking Greek.
Stop tweeting.
It's all
people.
Greek to me. So they're go gamble. They gamble. They have this really great scene where Cassavetes keeps throwing dice and winning, and then all of a sudden he just throws the wrong dice, and like everyone gets kind of like and they each meet a woman and have moderate to success to failure with them. Ben Gazzara becomes infatuated with a woman that I think might be Adele's mom. She looks just like Adele. It's crazy how much she looks like Adele.
You're totally
it's
right.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Archie, in a scene that is both truly horrifying and absolutely hilarious, he approaches this older woman, Archie, and he's like, "Hey,
well, there's 2 older women that he approaches. The first one, absolutely no." Right? There's no success, and then
there's a woman. They're like, she's like, leave me alone. And then there's this other woman who's much older, who's like, sort of looks like she's a Renaissance painting. I don't know what's going on. And he's like, I'm looking for a lady. Yeah. And it feels at the beginning of the scene like he's joking around, like he's not being super serious with her. And she takes him at his word and is like, yeah, dude, I'm in. And like you don't know, it's all shot in these crazy close-ups, so you don't really know like what's going on.
What's fascinating because the camera's entirely on her. You don't see him during the scene.
For a big chunk of the scene.
Yeah.
And I think he loses his nerve and like becomes very uncomfortable because she grabs his hand and won't let go of it.
Well, because then he keeps saying things like, "I'm going to lose my mind if you don't like it," and she's like totally down for it.
Yeah, it's really. I wrote down like, what is Peter Falk doing here? It's they and then.
But then there's also like she's like smacking her lips in a really uncomfortable
It's
way.
real, and she's she's kind of a strange looking woman.
She is. But don't
So-
you? Yeah. This scene. I mean, this scene is just saturated with misogyny, though.
Yeah,
In the sense, like,
both
this woman's
both
presented
from the
as being,
character
like,
and maybe and also from the director.
well, she's presented as being like totally and utterly grotesque.
Yeah, and it's a gross scene.
So I mean, and obviously that nothing happens, nothing
But
comes of that scene.
Not
but
to say that it isn't misogynistic at all, but the power dynamic. Again, this is that interesting thing where Cassavetes is maybe being gross, but also like that woman wins that scene, which is really interesting.
Well, this
she
is
kind of maybe
because she
she's
freaks him
trying to
out.
humiliate
Yeah.
Peter Falk. That could be what it is,
But
but
that-
it doesn't read that way, and especially at the end, she seems utterly rejected when he finally gets away from her.
But that's also why I asked if she's a pimp, because she says to him like, "Oh, I could get you girls. What do you?" And
That's
he's like, "I don't
right.
want girls." He's like, "Do you want boys?" And he's like, "I don't want boys." And so I was like, like what's going on?
Also, I feel like Peter
there.
Falk spends the sole second half of this film floundering. Doesn't really know what he's doing
as a character.
as a character.
actor.
As an actor, he's
Nails it.
great throughout. It's no Columbo, but it'll do.
Well, I mean, what's Columbo?
And
the only thing
then
that's Columbo is fucking Johnny Staccato.
and
Tell me about
then
Johnny Staccato again. And then we cut back to
sorry,
the
I lost
hotel.
mine because I was looking at my notes.
It's all good.
They got back.
I
So
was
and
killing
John
it with the
Cassavetes
Johnny
has brought
Staccato
home
content, but you don't hear it.
a lovely English bird.
A lovely English.
Lovely English bird.
I believe
Ben
it's a heron.
Gazzara is with the Adele looking lady.
That looking lady.
And Peter Falk has brought home
With Julie.
Huh?
Her name's Julie.
Which one?
The woman that Peter Falk brings.
Oh, this
home?
woman Julie,
Yeah.
right, who seems much younger and
Much
uncomfortable. They go back to the hotel, all these women, they're in Peter Falk's room. John Cassavetes, man, to be in London in the 70s and have to deal with food, he orders a bottle of scotch, shrimp cocktail, endive salads,
I thought it was pronounced endive.
endive, whatever. It's all disgusting.
No, but you're right. I think he says endive.
I think he does too.
And lots of ice. Bring up lots
And
of ice.
and they're laying there and they don't know what to do, and Ben Gazzara starts to cry.
Yeah, and then
and there's-
Adele takes him away.
Takes him away.
And then, or she first gives him a massage, and then he says something that totally kills the movie. He's like, "Oh, my wife used to do that for me," and she's like, "This is terrible."
Exactly.
And then they all kind of separate, and they all go into their different rooms, and they all have terrible encounters with all three of these women.
Yeah,
that they
there's
kind of are hooking up
there
with.
might be a scene that's even more troubling than the domestic abuse scene
Which is
between
this-
John Cassavetes and
Mary.
Mary. They lay on the bed and he will not let her get up. He will not get off of her. It's
Right.
shot in a painful close up.
Yeah, so they're fighting. So basically, what happened?
Are they fighting?
Well, that's the thing. They're like wrestling, and at times the scene is shot in such a way where she seems to be totally in on it because she's like laughing with him
Yeah.
and kind of like enjoying herself. But then there are other moments where she's like, "Get the fuck off me! Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, don't touch me! Don't kiss me!" It's a really really disturbing scene, and then it's kind of that way. Also, I totally forgot about this, but at some point, because it's filmed like entirely, well, it's kind of like filmed from her perspective, not POV, but
Yeah. She's the
where-
dominant figure in the
where
frame.
she's like thrown over on the side of the bed, and he's
Yeah.
supposed to be kind of like on top of her, and the screen goes almost entirely
black. Yeah, it's actually a strange.
It's a strange.
It's also
shot scene.
basically one take, which I mean speaks to a lot of this.
It's a very disturbing scene.
It's very long.
It's actually in so.
It's
damn
probably
long.
5-6 minutes of
And
uncut.
And it's, to me, it's the most disturbing scene.
It's
in the
really
film.
troubling. And it also, because up to this point, and this is maybe what makes this film a success, I think that optimistically you want to look for the good things about these guys, and you're really able to discover a lot of it in Cassavetes' character. He's kind of the most level-headed, and he's kind of the leader, and he's really disgusting
In this scene,
in this scene. And actually, I went to see this movie when I saw it at BAM, and it was like a Friday afternoon at like 4. It was an early screening, and there were 3 walkouts
During the scene?
during the movie, and I think 2 of the walkouts was a pair of people. And interestingly, all the walkouts were women, and they were all people of color. All the white dudes
Were,
hung
like, totally,
around,
yeah.
and it's. I mean, whether that means anything or
I
not.
seriously considered fast forwarding this scene the second
Really?
time. Yeah, because I remember seeing it the first time. I was like, "What? Why?
Yeah.
This scene is so fucking long."
It might be the least. I don't know. I this is one of these moments where I really that give birth to what I think are like why I want to look at these films, because I don't think that scene has anything to do except be psychologically terrible and painful, and there's nothing masterful about it. There's nothing cinematic about it, except that it might be a long take, but like that's placing aesthetics above content.
But there are cuts.
Just,
it's not a single take.
No, but it's designed, to feel long.
That way. Oh no, yeah,
and not. I think there's something experiential about the way he makes movies, as opposed to like, you don't get the point and move on. He kind of like harps on things and maximalize. He's a maximalist in that sense, that he just keeps digging into things deeper and deeper and deeper.
To some degree.
And it, in the sense that he wants you to feel one thing, and it's really exhausting. And I understand why people walk out of this movie.
Although I will say this also, there is this interesting, again, exchange of dialogue in this scene, which again, sorry to harp on this, sounds like it's straight out of Beckett, where I think she says, "I can't go on anymore," and he says, "Then don't go on anymore," or something along those lines.
Oh, interesting.
Which sounds exactly, obviously, like Beckett.
That's a very Beckett thing.
The other interesting thing about this scene, in terms of its length, is that it's the longest scene of the three of them with these three women.
Yeah, the next one is Peter Falk and
Julie.
And
hold on. Also, you can't. I mean,
don't tell me
sorry.
to hold on. Just kidding. Continue.
This is also where I was thinking. Again, I don't know who in their right mind can watch that scene and think, "Oh, these are just guys having a good time." You know what I mean? Like, these scenes are, especially this scene and then Fox scene with Julie,
which is awful.
Yeah, another awful scene. I don't see how these scenes can't be seen in any other way than just indictments on these dudes.
Yeah.
Zara's scene is the chillest scene, because obviously nothing happens. It seems like it's post
and it's kind of unshaped. They're unshaped. They don't feel. This is one of these like terrible indulgences, and when I bristle when people are like, "He's such a genius," because I don't know. I mean, these films are very heavily scripted, and he spent a lot of time with these guys writing the parts for them. Like, the whole idea was they would improvise and then write and improvise and write. So like, there's a lot baked into the personality. The characters are really very strongly drawn from the characters. But yeah, it really, maybe this is the point, but if the point is to make me feel uncomfortable and challenged by this,
it works.
But then what's the point? Like, and in the sense that, like, it's not that I shouldn't feel those things, but like, I wonder if he has anything larger to say about this like terrible toxic masculinity than just like, "Hey, isn't this masculinity terrible?" Not a wrong thing to say, but like, it feels kind of raw in a way that doesn't. I don't know. I find it challenging because I feel like it's a little unshaped, and I don't know how I'm meant to feel beyond disgusted. And it's good to feel disgusted by disgusting behavior, but what does that do for the goals of the film, if there are any?
Well, so what makes the Fox scene also awful is not only is it misogynistic, but it's racist. So Julie is Asian. It seems like she doesn't speak English.
Yeah.
And then he basically in the scene
berates her.
Well, so they start kissing. And then at some point he like doesn't like the way she's kissing him.
Right.
He's like, "You suck wind. What are you doing? You're sucking," like, I don't understand.
And she's crying.
So there's like these 30 seconds of them passionately kissing each other, and the close up here is actually really fascinating. I think it's it's actually well shot. And then at some point, something obviously unseen or that you can't tell happens. Who the hell knows if anything actually ever happens? It's just like Fox.
Does she push him away?
I thought he pushes her.
Yeah, there's something.
It's shot in such an intense close-up that you can't tell. But basically, they separate, and he starts yelling at her and berating her.
And she starts crying.
And one of the things that he berates her for is for being an Asian woman and not speaking English. So this scene is also
You can say
awful.
anything. He says something like, "You just say something."
Just say something, yeah.
And then we cut to what I think is the most sort of uplifting, weird scene in the film, which is Gazzara chatting with Adele looking. What's her name? Do we know her character? I don't know if we ever learned her character's name.
I don't.
But he's talking about his wife, and he keeps talking about his wife in the second half of this film.
He's like, "I feel so damn disloyal."
Yeah, he says, "I feel disloyal. My heart's breaking," and he's crying, or he's very emotional. And it's like a 45-second scene. It might be the shortest scene in the film. And then we cut
right, which is
to a new scene with Cassavetes.
Which is what's really fascinating with these three scenes is like that he gets the very short scene, and it's obviously not disturbing. or not disturbing in the same way that the other two scenes are.
And the next scene is pretty disturbing too, because we cut to a scene. They go to a place called the Soup Kitchen.
This is Cassavetes.
Cassavetes and Mary go to a soup
yeah.
kitchen place, and they have sort of this confrontational.
Stupid question. We were supposed to assume they had sex.
Yeah, and they're still together, and it's maybe the next day or something.
Next morning,
next
that's
morning.
what it feels like.
And they go to this place and they order coffee, and then they just argue, and I'm not really sure what they're arguing about.
Correct.
Except that they seem to love and be annoyed by each other at the exact
same time. Well, he says something like, "I like aggressive women," and then she gets mad at him or something, and then she complains about his little white hands.
Also worth noting, sort of an extra outside of the film, but like, how old do you think this actress is?
I would guess in her late 20s.
She's 24.
Wow. Yeah, she looks really young.
She looks young.
These women are definitely age.
They're far too young.
I also wrote a note about this. I was like, these guys are definitely punching above their weight class in the sense of like the attractiveness of these women.
Swarthy men. Yeah.
Like, all three of these women are like beautiful, and I mean Cassavetes is a good-looking guy, but like
Ben Gazzara, don't you speak ill?
You think?
I think Ben Gazzara is incredibly handsome.
Well,
but I have a Ben Gazzara crush.
You have a crush, yeah.
I think he's amazing. But yeah, I
mean, he's charismatic, but
yeah. Do you think there's a subtextual? Like, these are all guys who, like, I don't know, like Cassavetes, we've started to notice, seems to refer to his Greek heritage a lot more than I originally thought. Ben Gazzara, like, it's Italian guy. Like, there's a certain quality of them kind of being those like first or second generation,
these white ethnic
guys, and I think that there's not really brought up in the film, but that's definitely an element.
It's a subtext. It's in the air.
It's definitely there. I don't know what Falk's ancestry is, but he could be Italian. He could be. I don't know, but it's interesting. Really, I'm having trouble.
Wings of Desire. He's an angel, man.
Yeah, he's a total angel. I'm having trouble, really even kind of contextualizing these late scenes because they just seem to be the kind of typical. Like the worst thing people call the Cassavetes movies are actor exercises, and there's a quality to them of being like. Then you argue, and then you do this, and then you know what I mean, and it doesn't really add up to much.
It fits into the context, I think. It's kind of it's building. It's almost like a logical kind of conclusion. Like, well, what are these guys that are having midlife crises gonna do? They're gonna go out like carousing and look for women,
right? And be sort of terrible.
It's just awful the way it's presented and filmed,
right? Which is probably appropriate.
So then they have this awkward. Conversation,
soup kitchen conversation,
and then there's the scene with Falk and Julie
where they're out in the rain, and she's trying to leave.
Yeah, he's trying to get her a cab or something.
Yeah, and there's this like terrible ADR recording. Like they clearly didn't get the sound they needed, and it's just a very strange scene in that regard.
Yeah,
soaking wet.
And then she gets in the cab. She
leaves.
You don't see her in the cab, do you? She does leave though.
Yeah, she leaves, and this is kind of a moment where Cassavetes' relationship with this young woman doesn't really go anywhere. Obviously, Falk's relationship with Julie doesn't go anywhere. And we're left with those two guys kind of alone, kind of sobering up in a sense, realizing that like this escapade to London, which was originally going to just be them putting him in a hotel room and coming back, has led them very far astray. And I think that this is the moment where they kind of go, what the fuck have we done? Why are we here?
And they decide to come back.
And this, to me, is that didactic scene. Because there's this bit where
kind of explaining what
they're
back
about. In the room. Falk and Cassavetes, all of the furniture from Gazzara's room has been moved into their room, and it's never explained. There's a lot that's unexplained. And Cassavetes starts counting their children and their cars.
It doesn't like there's 5
and their
kids
garages. We have 5 kids, 4 garages. And like it feels clunkily didactic in the sense that like let's weigh our freedom versus the fruits of our labor, kind of like we own these beautiful houses in Port Washington and we have families and like
or they're responsible. But don't you think it's also kind of like a sense of we're kind of responsible?
Sure, if you want to claim that there's a responsibility that these guys, or that these surely they have responsibilities. Are they responsible people? Is an entirely different question.
Which is also kind of like, was there ever a time in history where like a person's husband could disappear for 4 or 5 days and then just come back? And obviously Nick at the very end says like, "Oh, you're in trouble. Mom's really pissed at you." But like, how does that marriage not end right then and there?
It's a good question. I mean, well, one marriage does end because Ben Gazzara, our final scene with Ben Gazzara coming back to old Benny, Falk and Cassavetes go into his hotel room. He's there with 3 women.
New women.
Adele's gone. And they're just kind of singing and having a good time. And it's very, very clear that Peter Falk ain't coming back.
Ben Gazzara.
And I feel like these scenes just feel a little shapeless and amorphous to me. I can't like honestly say to you, this is what I remember like them talking about or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, and then they leave.
Cassavetes and Falk leave.
See them again on the plane. I don't remember what the exchange is like on the plane, but I think
they're drinking pretty heavily. Shocking. Yeah, no, I think Falk has 2 whiskeys in like the period of 2 minutes.
And then they get back home.
Right.
And this is actually kind of like an interesting scene too. So they're back home. They're back in Port Washington. They have huge
bags of toys that they bought at LaGuardia or JFK or wherever they flew into. They buy all the gifts at the airport.
And like Cassavetes keeps asking him, like, what are we going to do without him? What are we going to do without him? And Falk is just
what are we going to do without Gazzara?
Yeah.
And Gazzara's like, you have your orange thing?
No, sorry. What's he going to do without us?
Yeah. So basically the line
us?
is, what is Ben Gazzara going to do without John Cassavetes and Peter Falk? And Falk is like, you got your orange thing?
Yeah.
You got this toy? You got that toy? You got the 3 hats? You got all this stuff? And it's an interesting kind of wrap up because throughout, Falk seems like the character with the least amount of confidence in anything that he does. Gazzara starts the film sort of like as the responsible one and obviously ends the film in a very different... Well, he's cut off ties, so maybe there's a responsibility in being like, I can't be in this sham marriage anymore or whatever. And it's interesting that the film ends with Cassavetes returning with bags of gifts and his little daughter who cries when she sees him, and it's heartbreaking. And then Nick Cassavetes is like, Dad, where you been, Dad?
You're
and I
in
wrote
trouble,
down, like,
Dad.
of course he has a shitty kid.
He's like, hey,
Mom, Dad's back.
You're in trouble, Dad.
And then he's like, Mom, hurry up. And you're like, who is this kid? And Cassavetes hugs his little daughter, who's so cute. And then he shakes Nick's hand.
Like a manly shake.
Oh, man. And then he hands Nick the bag, and they walk around the corners of the back of the house.
The end.
And the end.
And that's the end of this monster of a movie.
It's a long movie. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes. It might be shorter than Faces.
It is. I think it is shorter than Faces. I thought
oh my God, Faces is the longest movie ever made. Faces is still on.
So this is... Yeah, so again, this film, man. I mean, like the first hour is just
astonishing,
amazing, and then
because it hews closer to like a clearer narrative, which, not a paint by number narrative, but like a narrative rooted in character. And then it feels like in the second half, he was just kind of like.
I don't feel like it's formless in the second half, to be honest with you. I just feel like it's really disturbing and disturbing in a disturbing way.
Yeah, it is. Maybe it's not formless,
and that's why I wasn't looking forward to maybe the second half too. I thought like. I think you're right. I mean, maybe aesthetically, also formally, it does drag in certain ways, but I would also maybe argue that that's kind of the point, that it kind of is supposed to end in these really dead end sort of ways, because again, it represents kind of the fact that there's kind of like no hope for these 2 guys.
So let me ask you though, like, this kind of comes back to the root of this whole thing, which is like, it's not formless. It's an aesthetic. There's aesthetic decisions going on.
Correct.
There seems to be a real cultural decision to like call the work that he does genius all the time. But what is the value of the second hour of this film?
I think there are moments of genius throughout this film, even in the second half.
But why is it genius? Like what makes it genius?
The performances.
And like the astute psychological observation.
The performances, and I think also when it is critiquing. Again, how the banality of domestic life, I think that's also kind of like inside. I think by now, obviously, it's been done to death, and it seems like an easy critique. But I think that the fact that this film is over 40 years old, and when it was done, I think there's something kind of powerful about that.
Yeah, no, I think so too.
And the fact that again, like even like that it's not didactic, that these characters are both really sympathetic and also horrible human beings.
Yes, that's true. But there's a didacticism to that scene where they're sort of counting their shit. Like, I don't know, like
I think that's fair.
in the sense that like these are guys who aren't really going to have to deal with a lot of their struggles in life are entirely existential. In this and they have the luxury to have existential crises, which I think is really
I also totally agree with
is the
that.
film self-aware of that.
That it's kind of masturbatory.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if it's that self-aware.
I think we would all like it to be really self-aware.
I think it's supposed to take their trials and tribulations seriously.
Which,
like, feel bad for them because they have been
So
crushed by these institutions.
so I think as guys commenting on the film, I think it's
Guys commenting on films.
Welcome to guys commenting on films. I gotta ask, like, do we take it seriously? And
Do we take what
do we take
seriously?
their trials and tribulations
No.
seriously? Okay, I don't think so
Fuck
either.
these
But secondly, fuck them. Secondly, should anybody else?
The last people you should feel bad for are, like, dentists making six figures.
Right.
who live on Long Island.
Right. And like Will can go on benders for 6 days and suffer no consequence.
Like, yeah, exactly. Do you know how
Right.
difficult it is having a beautiful house and a beautiful wife
Oh,
and
it
beautiful
sucks.
kids? Although, I mean, Nick, he's kind of a brat.
Oof, I hate that kid.
Oh my God.
Would you ever show this movie to anyone?
Would I show?
Would you show this movie to your partner?
Would I show? I don't like. Hey, let's sit down and have a good night
Yeah,
and watch,
yeah.
watch Husbands.
I don't think I would.
Can we just talk about?
I wouldn't.
Can we just talk about Rosetta by the Dardenne brothers, which is the
Can we
greatest film of
focus,
all time?
please? Can
Sorry.
we focus?
On the Johnny Staccato scale, I give this 3 out of 5.
3 out of 5 staccatos. I give it 3.2 staccatos. So I give it
man,
like
you're doing the 0.2.
I
thought you
give
could
no,
do, like,
I give it like a
half.
3-4. I don't know, maybe a 3. Maybe before I tell you this,
the first
before I
hour was amazing.
rewatched it, I probably would give it a 4 or 5. Now I'm sort of in the 3 zone.
This
I'm more repulsed by this movie, and not just because the subject matter is repulsive, than I was before we watched it.
it definitely makes you feel like you've been on a bender.
Yeah, and it also just like fuck you guys, fuck these guys, and also like
There are ways to have
There are-
existential crises that don't take you down these roads.
there are also better, more modern, and this is not at all the fault of John Cassavetes, but like why are we still referring to this movie as or why would you know what I mean? Like
Why
it's
are
a-
me and you?
why no, but like I just feel like there's a real, and this might make it powerful, and I'm rambling a little bit, but like there's the film as a powerful statement on masculinity and toxic masculinity, and then there's the fact that it just traffics in toxic masculinity for 2 hours, and like I'm exhausted by it. I'm exhausted by the ambiguity of like, does the movie like I'm exhausted by John Cassavetes at this point, his kind of like lack of
got
commentary.
like 5 more films to go.
Yeah, and I think from here they get more new. There's a little more going on. There's a little more nuance to some of these later, maybe more filmmaker nuance in some
But
of these
it
later
is also
films.
interesting to
Don't
compare-
at me,
to compare this film.
Cassavetes lovers.
It is interesting. I'm gonna at you. It is interesting to compare these films to, for example, like Mad Men, and kind of the
Yes.
fact that like here we are 40 years later and we're still kind of trafficking.
I'd
in the
rather
same
watch
tropes.
Mad Men.
Well,
Might be the title of my this episode.
because you could because those episodes are only 45 minutes
That's
long.
true. Yeah, but there's a million of them. There's like 80 episodes of that
And
show.
the portrayal of women on that is far more nuanced.
Yeah, I guess this is no fault of the films, but I'm just exhausted by
This
maybe these 2 movies in
kinda
a
trope.
row, and like
I am exhausted of the of like upper middle class people, upper middle class white people having
problems.
problems.
I'm also exhausted by anyone still thinking that this is all that important.
This particular film.
Yeah, or
I think
the
that's fair.
subject matter, or the sort of. I mean, yes, John. I don't know. I feel like maybe
I think no. I mean, I think
I'm just exhausted by how seriously we still take it.
There's a difference between saying that this director has made very important films, which I think you could say, and then also obviously separate from the fact that there's a lot of problematic shit happening in these films.
Right.
So
Yeah. Agreed.
yeah. So like, and there's something I've noticed so far in all of the Cassavetes films is that there's so many interesting moments and brilliant moments,
Yeah.
but that there's also just
Tedium.
a lot of crap. Just a lot of crap.
A lot of crap.
I mean, maybe
Should we leave it there?
A lot of crap.
I'm kind of hoping Minnie and Moskowitz provides a little bit of relief.
Have we described Cassavetes is a brotor yet? Because that term definitely fits.
Broter. Hey guys, what's up? I'm a broter.
And don't use that in any sort of non-ironic way.
All right, well, I guess we should wrap it up there. Thanks so much for listening. This has been a long one, but there's a lot to process with this.
Yeah,
with
and I
this
didn't even
film.
really do my book report, but maybe next time.
Actually, we should talk a little bit. Let's go back. Let's
right now?
because here's what we can do.
So I give that book 2.4 Johnny Staccatos.
No, I think we should. Maybe we save that for a bonus episode. Maybe it'd be good to make your book report a bonus episode.
Maybe not. That sounds awful. But basically, what I'd very quickly want to say is I feel like the tradition that book is borrowing from, like the American pragmatist tradition, is just totally and completely not the tradition that these films are.
Tell me more about American pragmatism.
Borrowing from. I wish I could tell you more about American pragmatism. I'm not.
Sounds like maybe you're not. If you were to.
So here's what I want to say. So very quickly, one of Carney's central arguments is that these films are very much about kind of like reconstituting the self or versions of the self.
Sure.
And a certain kind of like reconstitution of the self that doesn't end in disintegration. And I think all of these films so far are really, really much about like disintegration, not like a reintegration of the self or like a kind of creation of the self, but
the falling apart of the self.
Apart of the self. So again, we disagreed on this, but like the end of Faces, the couple walks away, and you felt as if kind of this has happened plenty of times before, and I felt like no, I think this was kind of the end.
I'm coming
of the
around
marriage.
to your argument.
And this movie also, I think it's about the destruction of the bonds that these three men who are clearly in love with one another have. At the beginning of the film, there's three. Well, it also begins with obviously the death of the fourth one, and it ends with now there just being two of them. And I didn't see any hope in Cassavetes' character returning home or Falk's character returning home. It's not
very hopeful.
Yeah,
maybe for Falk, but
it struck me
really.
not as if kind of this was like these characters coming back home, but the complete opposite. Like you can't come back home.
I'm actually gonna. I think I see your point, but I also think that if you think about this through that lens of what they call the hero's journey, whatever, which is like a very common.
Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, but Joseph Campbell, the idea that a character returns literally home having changed and lost something. There's an argument to be made that in that context, the act of coming home is a kind of victory because
it's a renewal.
It's a renewal, but it's also like they've sort of danced with kind of that freedom of being untethered or whatever again, and the choice is still to go home and to become part of that, you know what I mean? So that actually the optimist in me thinks that's hopeful. Which I mean,
I will say this though, what the Carney book gets right is that these films are I think very modernistic in the sense that Cassavetes is also obsessed with the thin line between art and reality.
Love and hate.
Oh, another great
art
film.
and reality. He is very.
He's about very much suggesting that there's something. I think I don't know. Like again, like there should be a thin line between art and reality. That they're one and the same. That the aesthetic can be incorporated into kind of like daily life. So obviously the fact that he's obsessed with these very kind of like banal everyday occurrences and events, that to me strikes me as being very much kind of a modernist thing. And
interesting.
Who the fuck wants to listen to a podcast about modernism?
Not this guy.
Not this guy.
I think
either.
we leave it there.
I didn't even get to talk about the Kierkegaard stuff. Sickness unto death. Maybe next time.
God. Well, you're George Fragopoulos.
And you're Liam Billingham.
And this was
Uberbusters.
Keep in touch. Twitter.